Well, I was speaking to a Zimbabwean here in Johannesburg last night, and he said the Zimbabweans in South Africa wouldn't be celebrating. Now, that's important to note because 25% of the Zimbabwean population has fled the country in recent years. So it's just as many Zimbabweans nearly here than they are in Zimbabwe. So that's the mood, that's the feeling I got just from one person I spoke to. That they're embarrassed, they're depressed about what's happening back home. From what we're hearing back in Zimbabwe, is going to be some sort of perhaps a facade of celebration. There's going to be parades, and in a traditional African way, cows are going to be slaughtered. There's going to be a football match. And we do know, as you said, that President Robert Mugabe is going to speak for the first time publicly since those all crucial elections. But really, when it comes down to it, I think there is going to be very muted celebration.
Robyn, there is continued pressure on Mr Mugabe and on Zimbabwe coming from South Africa, G8, the European Union and, of course, the United States. They're all urging the release of those election results, but those aren't forthcoming. Is all this international pressure actually making any difference?
You know, that's a good question. I think we can only answer that when something decisive happens. But at the moment, it's you know, same old, same old. Those results have not been released. And I think we only know when pressure works is when actually something happens. And, you know, 3 weeks on, those all-important presidential results have not been released. And I think that is the proof is in the pudding there. But the fact remains is that it is important that the African leaders step up to the plate. And I think that these calls from the international community for African leaders to put pressure on Robert Mugabe is important. Whether or not they do, and whether there's going to be a shift, and whether or not Mr. Mugabe listens to them, if they do put pressure on him, well, that's a whole other story.
Because, of course, there's already been a lot of discontent, hasn't there, coming from Mr Tsvangirai about the role of Mr Mbeki, his role as a mediator. So what can happen next in the face of that?
Well, Mr Tsvangirai has actually called for Mr Mbeki, the South African president, to step down. He's been the point man in the negotiations between the opposition and the government in Zimbabwe over the past few years. And it's widely believed that these negotiations, of course, have failed. But Mbeki really seems to be clinging on to his policy of quiet diplomacy, coming out last weekend saying there's no crisis. His government has stepped back a little bit in recent days, saying, well, you know, it's time these results are released. But I think the fact that Mr Mbeki has perhaps been increasingly isolated this week in the way he is being called to step aside for the Zambian president to be the point man on any negotiations is an indication that maybe things are shifting. But I don't see Mr Mbeki giving up his role, so to speak, of being the point man on this very easily either.
And of course, throwing into this very critical mix at the moment, a shipment of arms appearing on its way to Zimbabwe. What's the story behind that, and what's the reaction to that shipment of arms?
Well, what a sensitive thing to happen just for China and, of course, for Zimbabwe. Embarrassing also for South Africa in the midst of all of this. But that the South African government has confirmed to CNN that shipment of arms was docked and is docked in Durban and is on its way to Zimbabwe. By all accounts, reports say that there are a variety of arms, maybe ammunition, rocket launching machinery, that sort of thing. So it is of great concern. And indeed, I think the sensitivity of this is worrying. Why, as Mr. Tsvangirai said in his interview with Nkipile Mabuso, is the Zimbabwean government not importing food? So there is that concern that perhaps the ante is being upped by the Zimbabweans. We've heard increasing reports of violence, of intimidation, and the fact that perhaps more arms are going to be in the hands of the Ministry of Defence and the security apparatus over there, well, that is expressly concerning for many people here in South Africa and in the international community. But I think from the South African point of view, they say legally they can't interfere with any sort of bilateral deal between Zimbabwe and China. China, of course, one of Mr. Mugabe's biggest allies in recent years. And because Zimbabwe is landlocked and South Africa has extensive coastline, there is often and continually goods and shipments that are transported through to Zimbabwe via South Africa. I saw it myself when I was on the border. Huge trucks constantly going into Zimbabwe from South Africa. So the South Africans in a tricky position, but many people here are saying South Africa has a moral obligation to stop this shipment and to put pressure on Mr. Mugabe. Whether they're going to do that or not is seemingly quite unlikely.